Fine, with the master Levi Cherbulenko, in EV series, I analyze the openings of people rated anywhere between 8,000 and 2,000. The following is a chess.com game played between 1859 versus 1853. Let's start. Alright, so e4, e5, bishop c4. Okay, this is interesting. The most common move is knight f3, developing the knight attacking the pawn. But bishop c4 is pretty good as well. It puts the bishop on this best diagonal, where it has an open diagonal. It is not blocked, right, by any pawn, and it attacks the weakest link in black's camp, which is f7. f7 is the Achilles heel in chess, the weakest link for black, as is f2 for white. Okay, so bishop c4 is also not bad. Okay, knight to c6. Another move would be knight to f6. In general, it's better to prioritize kingside minor pieces development first, so that we can quickly castle, right? Knight f6, bishop c5, and castle. Once the king is safe, you know, then you can think about the queenside pieces as well. So that's as a rule of thumb, but knight c6 is fine. Okay, knight to c3, developing the c3 knight. So as you can see, white postpones for now the development of a g1 knight. Let's see, knight c3 developing the knight. Knight f6, black also develops his knight. Pawn to d3, strengthening this pawn and also opening up this bishop. Again, white does not rush with knight f3. There is a reason for that. Let's see. Bishop e7. Okay, this already is too passive, I think. Why put the bishop on e7 if we can put it on c5, on this much better diagonal, mirroring white? So the same as white played bishop c4, we play bishop c5, attacking white's weakest link, white's Achilles heel, which is f2. And then we can play d6 and maybe eventually knight g4 ideas potentially, right? But the bishop on c5 is much more active than on e7. On e7, it has only one upside, or potentially two. One upside is that if white ever goes like bishop g5 and pinning the knight, then you know, black will have no problem. There won't be any real pin. Like when they go bishop c5, pawn to d6, typically white may play like bishop g5, pinning the knight, and then because the pawn is on d6, black cannot go back to e7 because the chain has been closed. But if they play bishop e7, now already bishop g5 is not a real threat. But I mean, that's easy to tackle. I mean, black can just play bishop c5 and then play h6 if they want to prevent bishop g5, and then play d6, right? First h6 and then d6 if they want. So that's another thing. On c5, maybe sometimes white can like exchange the knight against the bishop, play knight a4 potentially, right? And then take the bishop. Let's say we go bishop b6 and then knight takes b6, ab. And we know that bishops are stronger than knights, especially in open positions, because we are long range. Bishops are 3.5 points, knights are 3 points. So knight a4 potentially, but even this is easy to defend against. Black could just play pawn a6 at some point, you know. And then if white ever goes knight a4, we just go bishop a7. They create this a7 home for the bishop. So that's very common, right? We go d6, a6, and then if white ever attacks the bishop, bishop a7. So bishop on c5 is more active. I'd say this would be like the biggest upside, maybe. Like I said, potentially maybe to guard on the king side, but I mean, black could just play h6 and defend. Yeah. So yeah, I think all in all, bishop c5 is more aggressive, but yeah, bishop e7 just looks a bit passive. Okay, knight f3. Okay, this I don't like. This obviously is not a mistake, but it kills our whole purpose. All these last moves, they build up to something, and now we just destroy it by playing knight f3. It's like, then why did we start with bishop c4, knight c3, pawn d3, all this stuff, if in the end we still play knight f3? We could have played knight f3 on the second move, if that was our goal. So the whole point, so this is the Vienna setup. This is the Vienna game setup. When we play knight c3, bishop c4, pawn d3, this is called the Vienna. The whole point of the Vienna is that the whole point to postpone this knight, the development of a knight on f3. The whole point is so that we can play pawn f4 first, and then put the knight behind the pawn. That is the whole point. Our idea is to attack on the king side. And then three things will happen. If black ever takes on f4, we take, let's say, with the bishop, our f5 will open. So after we castle and stuff, right, our rook will be on f1. Both our rook and bishop target f7. This is a very nice tandem. We attack f7 with the rook and the bishop. So we have pressure on the f file. If black does not take, let's say, play d6 or something in the future, Another situation is we could take on e5, and then again it's the same. Our rook and our bishop attack f7. The f file opens up, and we have huge pressure on f7. Maybe when our knight from f3 can go to g5, and again attack f7, right? But we create this semi-open f file, meaning it's open for our rook. We have no pawn in front of it, but it's blocked for black's rook because we have a pawn on f7. So this is ideal, yeah? When you have an open file for you, but it's blocked for your opponent. Semi-open files are great for you. And the final situation is maybe even more dangerous, maybe the most dangerous, would be that and black like castles at some point, right? Would be to play pawn f5. Pawn f5 to gain space on the king side, to close the position down. When you play f5, there's no more exchanges because you don't take, they cannot take, right, on f4 because you play f5. So you close the game down. And when you close the game down, it's much easier to attack on the king side. Because if the game is open, they can, you know, create counterplay in the center, attack and stuff. But if it's all closed down, by definition, there is no counterplay. And so you have much more chances of success. So you play f5, gaining space on the king side, and then you could even castle queen side potentially in that case if you play f5 if you want. And then you can like pawn storm black, you can steamroll them, right, with g4, g5, with huge attack on the king side basically. Like once you get this pawn on f5, that gives you huge initiative on the king side. That is the main point of f4, of this whole Vienna stuff, is to play f4, knight f3. And at least when we play bishop to c5, that makes f4 a bit maybe more harder. Why? Because when you play f4, you weaken this diagonal, the c5 g1 diagonal. And so then you have to be more precise. Because then sometimes there's this risk of, you know, we can play d6, knight g4, and then bishop c5, knight on g4, attacking f2, there's a threat of bishop f2, there's a threat of knight f2, attacking the queen and the rook, right? So you have to be already more subtle in that case, right? But with a bishop on e7, we play f4, where all the upsides with no downside. Like the biggest downside of f4 potentially is the weakening, again, like I said previously, over a7, g1 diagonal. So that's why, again, bishop c5 is more testing, you know. But yeah, knight f3 just kills the whole purpose of this whole system. So yeah, not good, not good. Okay, pawn to d6 makes sense. Pawn to h3 makes sense. Potentially, maybe black wanna play bishop g4, pinning the knight, play like knight d4, right? So h3 is a useful prophylactical move against bishop g4, that's fine. Okay, castles. Oh, pawn a3, that's also actually not bad. I'm surprised by this move. This is also not bad. Good prophylactical move. Now, why is that? If white is not careful, if white simply castles, now black has a very good move. Now, which is white's key piece in these kind of positions? White's key piece is the light square bishop, because it's so great. It puts pressure on this long diagonal. It is white's best piece. Without it, white doesn't really have any advantage. It's white's best piece. So now we need to apply prophylactic thinking. If white did not play a3, if white castled, what would black play? Knight a5. And now wherever we go, we lose it. Bishop d5, we can just take or play c6. Bishop b3, I mean, we just take. So what remains? Bishop b5, well, just a6. Bishop a4, b5. Bishop b3, knight takes b3. Now or later, the threat is stronger than the execution. They can even take later because the bishop has no moves anyway, because bishop d5 pawn to c6 or just take. But let's say just take now, for example. ab and bishop b7. Black has no problems. Next, we can either strike in the center potentially, prepare d5, first defend the e5 pawn, and then prepare d5. Why? Because we have two bishops. And especially this bishop, they want to open up this diagonal. And then it will have no counterpart, no opposition. So the bishop will have great pressure on the diagonal with no opposition. That's why it's so good. Or another idea, when you have this kind of pawn structure, like symmetrical, d3, e4 versus d6, e5, is typically very good to play f5. And again, after like they take or we take, again they put pressure on this pawn, right? So they will take, and then the e4 pawn will be a target, or we will take on f5, right? And then this bishop will open up. Again, it makes a lot of sense with a bishop on b7 to play f5 to activate this bishop and this rook as well. And then it depends. If white doesn't take, they can either take on e4, or maybe they can play pawn f4. And then g5, g4, because now h3 is a pawn hook, so it will help black after g5, g4 open up the file, the g file. king h8, rook g8, right? And then open up a g file. Using the h3 pawn as a hook, meaning to create pawn break, meaning to open up a file. You know, or if we take pawn f5, then again this bishop will open up. So yeah, so that's why always beware of this knight a5. But what's the rule of thumb? The rule of thumb is we have to first play d6. Otherwise, like knight a5 is not really a threat when there's no pawn on d6, because if now knight a5, there's knight takes e5. So we have to first defend the pawn, play d6, and only after we defend the pawn, then knight a5 is a threat. Okay, so I mean, we could even play knight a5 now, yeah. It's just the king is in the center, but we still could, of course. Bishop b5 is like pawn to c6, bishop a4, b5. It still would have worked perfectly fine. So actually, yeah. Actually, knight a5 we could have played, but okay. Anyway, pawn a3, okay. Now knight a5 versus bishop h2. So this is absolutely a key move. Good move by white. Yeah, good for white. Okay, bishop e6. Okay, that makes sense. As I said, the white's key piece in this kind of openings, in this kind of structures, is white slice square bishop. Now, ideally, black wants to trade his knight against the bishop, of course. But if they cannot, bishop versus bishop is also good. If black can achieve it, that is also good for black. So that's why bishop e6 is also good. Yeah, knight to d5, huh? Now there's of course different possibilities here, not just one. One is there's a couple: knight d5, taking the bishop, allowing them to take, and playing bishop h2. They all have pluses and downsides. Now bishop e6, upside double pawns. On the downside, now although black has double pawns, this e6 key pawn controls the key weak light squares for black. Like previously, if you look now, black has weak light squares, where we potentially can put our knights on, d5 and f5. But after we take, this pawn suddenly controls the key light squares. So our, like, one of our biggest advantages is gone. 1, 2. Now this rook opens up. Imagine, by the way, if the bishop was on c5. Would have been a very nice tandem. Do you see? Again, bishop on c5. But anyway, the rook opens up. And so we have pressure on the f file, potentially this like knight h5, knight f4, activating the knight. The knight on f4 is the best because it attacks h3 and g2 especially. Then we can also bring the queen, play queen e8, queen g6, imagine, knight on f4, queen on g6, attacking g2. Maybe play rook f7, bring the second rook to f8, pressure on the f file. I mean, it's huge. So that's why this is maybe not ideal. Maybe not ideal. Another idea is to play maybe bishop a2. The point being, we do not want to take, right? Again, help him open up f file. And if we take, then we take. Yes, we exchange the bishops, but 1, his rook is now blocked. And 2, he still has weak light squares. And then maybe you can play knight e2, knight g3, knight f5 potentially. And put our knight on f5, for example. Yeah, still f5 is weak. That's another idea. Another idea might look a bit counterintuitive, but is to castle and let black double up our pawns. Yes, we have double pawns. But on the other hand, 1, our d file has just opened up. So we can play like queen e2, rook d1 and stuff, and maybe like even c5, right? Potentially pawn break. And also now we control d5 even more. Because now I have 2 pawns. This is kind of like a Marotti bind structure, if you know. But now I have even more control over d5 square. And f5 still. Do you see? So it looks like a downside double pawns, but on the other hand, we really control d5 very well. So it might be actually not bad for white. And finally, white played knight d5 is also sometimes an option. It depends, because sometimes black can like take, ed, and then we have double pawns. But these are not the ideal double pawns. Like in the previous case, it made sense, right? You'd control d5. Like if you just castled here, you'd control d5. So it's okay. Whereas here, if black like takes and then we go ed, there's really no point. Plus, if you play ed, yes, you have a bishop and black doesn't, but your bishop would be blocked by your own pawn. It would be a fixed structure, kind of like a fixed structure, not completely, but quite a bit fixed and blocked. And so then the knights are really better than bishops in fixed blocked positions, right? Your bishop would be just stuck against the d5 pawn. And so, yeah, maybe, I think, yeah, knight d5 I don't really like. I think black would even just like take, ed, and like knight b, and now his bishop is blocked. And now his bishop is blocked. And maybe then even eventually play first Play first h6 to prevent knight g5 and then f5 at some point. Move a knight somewhere, right? Play h6 because otherwise there's knight g5, knight e6, right? So play h6 and then pawn f5. This is another downside of ed. Previously, when the pawn was on e4, it was all equal, symmetrical. But now the pawn on d5, suddenly, we give black pawn majority in the center of the kingside. When there's no more pawn on e4 in front of the e-pawn, black's best plan is to push the pawns, because now we have pawn majority in the center of the kingside. So they just have initiative in the center of the kingside with f5. So not so sure about this. I think black would have just taken and would have been fine. But okay, black play queen d7. Let's see, maybe a couple more moves. They decided not to take. Okay, knight e7. Now it has a pair of two bishops. Knight e7. Bishop e6. I don't know about that. Maybe again, maybe just bishop a2. And when we take, just take over rook, right? Not to give black the e6 pawn, which controls the light squares, and open a their f file. So maybe bishop a2 would have been the easiest, maybe. But okay, it takes. Fe. Now the pawn controls the key light squares. The rook opens up. Bishop g5. Rook f7. Okay, I think we can stop around here. Yeah, I mean, white could have just castled. Bishop g5 is completely unnecessary. There's no point. Black can just play knight g6, pawn h6, attack the bishop. Makes no sense. So I think white should have just castled. And because white has a bishop, maybe open up the center at some point. Push either d4 or move a knight somewhere, maybe here, and then push f4. I know it's undoubling black's pawns, but we need to do something about it. We need to open the game up. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, black is gonna play like knight g6, knight h5, knight f4, and have a really strong hold on f4. Really strong knight on f4, and then play queen f7, queen g6, attacking g2. So that's another seemingly paradoxical plan, that we undouble their pawns, but we need to play f4 or d4, because this is not a weakness, e6, e5. These are very strong pawns, controlling key squares. This is a very sturdy, pawn formation. And f4 is very strong for black. But if we play d4, we open the game up, right? We open the game up, and then already f4 won't be strong for black. We don't have the support of a pawn. And then our bishop will be stronger in an open position. So yeah, but generally speaking, let's say it's a around equal dynamic equality, let's say, right? The better player should win. Yeah, alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.